Hi everyone, my name is Jeffrey Ladd. I'm here in Cologne, Germany, and Mac has asked if I would share some of the books that are in my library. I've gone ahead and I've chosen about a dozen things to share with you today, things that certainly I find interesting for one reason or another. And for you, they probably might give you a better idea of the range of different kind of photographically illustrated books that I'm interested in. And I hope you enjoy. The first thing I want to share with you is actually probably the most simple piece of printed matter that I could think of, which is just one photograph, one sheet of paper, Xeroxed. And that is of a flyer. Obviously it comes out of the genre of music of punk and hardcore, but this actually isn't a gig flyer. It's actually a flyer advertising the premiere of a documentary about a punk club from Costa Mesa, California that was called the Cuckoos Nest. It was active in the late 70s to kind of very early 1980s. And still to this day I have a soft spot for this kind of language of graphic design. And we all know that punk flyers appropriated photography basically from their start. They would take newspaper or magazine images. They would often reproduce famous photographers. You know, when I was a kid, I had a wall of my room basically wallpapered with, 8.5 by 11 punk and hardcore flyers. And I didn't know it then, but when I went to the School of Visual Arts and I had a photography history class, I recognized some of the photographs. It's like I had a Cartier-Bresson picture and a Louis Hine picture, and of course Dean Arbus, people like Ralph Eugene Meatyard. They were all quite popular images to use on punk and hardcore flyers. But this particular photograph that's on this flyer, you could only find in one place, in one book, and it actually happens to be a really, really well-known and very important photography book, at least very important for me, which is Mike Mandel and Larry Sultan's book, Evidence. How do I know that the person that Xeroxed it directly out of this book? Because the nature of the book Evidence is that Mike Mandel and Larry Sultan were gathering, of course, pictures from different private archives. It might be from science labs or different government agency. And they brought these images together into this book. And for those images, this was really the first time that any of those entered the public sphere. For those of you that know the book, you know, as I mentioned before, these are pictures gathered from different private agencies. And, you know, Mandel and Sultan were interested for the openness of reading. There's many different readings to these pictures, and that's what fascinated them, obviously. I only got to know this book when it was reprinted in 2003. DAP reprinted the book. But when I look through it, you know, coming from that kind of music scene where, of course, you know, bands would use often very serious and often tragic photojournalistic photographs and subvert them. They would use them in quite transgressive ways or use them as satire on flyers or album art. I find a similar kind of attitude in this book. You know, these are pictures that are primarily probably from the 50s to the, you know, early 70s. And although many of them are, you know, very serious pictures and very mysterious, there are others where it feels as though they're pointing out the absurdity of things, the absurdity of the world. And you can feel at times a kind of little sarcastic smirk behind Sultan and Mandel's edit. So I've always connected this book loosely with that music because it seems so much like they share so much in the imagery and the attitude towards the imagery. The other thing that I found fascinating, the plate size. You know, there's all different. There's 4x5 pictures and there's different ratio pictures, but the square pictures in particular resonated with me. For a long time I couldn't figure out like why it felt so familiar, why I kind of loved the squares in this book. And then I realized that of course, like if you grew up on that kind of music, the 7-inch record was an important medium. And it's the exact same size. The squares in this book are the same exact size as a 7-inch sleeve. It's just by pure coincidence. It's not planned. It's a brilliant book. I'm sure most of you know it. But super great. The next books kind of maybe follow in that same tone and attitude as Larry Sultan's book, and of course The Flyer, which is Ferdinand Kruevet's Stars Lexicon from 1971. For those of you that don't know, Ferdinand Kruevet was he's a Dusseldorf-based artist, and you might have actually seen, without knowing it, at least one piece if you have, you know, Ed van der Elsken's Sweet Life, because actually the very first plate, right after the captions, is one of his circular text pieces. The words are basically places, people, all around the world. So it's actually a setup for this world trip. And Kruevet actually translated from Dutch to German for the German edition of Sweet Life. A few years ago, in around 2007, I believe, they released this set of radio texts that he had done. So there's 3 picture discs, 3 12 inches, with his text pieces. And there's different recordings that he made. One about the 1972 election in the United States. One is about Apollo 11 moon landing. There's one that is called Voice of America. And I thought it would be interesting because there's so much overlap between the images and what he was recording that I'm going to play snippets of this while I show you the Stars books.
The election goes on. People. The election goes on. Republic. The election goes on. People's Party. People. People's Republican. And the people. New citizen and old settler. Black and white. Young and old. Rich and poor. North and white. Young and old. Rich and poor. North and south. Right and left. Some of the rich. Most of the poor.
President Nixon cares about people.
The Russian people, and the Chinese people, and the American people, and all the great peoples of the world. 56,000 American dead. America, America, my country, 'tis of thee.
Total Information Service. Information.
Hier ist der Hessische Rundfunk. Aus Frankfurt übrige Nachrichten.
Rechtsextremistische Terroristen.
5 leftist terrorists.
Terrorist attacks.
The Turkish Consul General in Los Angeles has been assassinated by gunmen.
One of the gunmen was killed, and the others captured.
Terrorist attacks. Reports from Kuwait say
Intelligence reports suggest that
Graceland, the mansion where Elvis Presley died in Memphis, Tennessee, is to be turned into a local museum.
in Beirut, a car bomb.
in West Germany 2 bombs.
Le président de la République est resté à Paris pour suivre la crise.
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Västeuropeiska produkter, inklusive konjak och whisky.
Des factions révolutionnaires armées libanaises.
L'organisation économiste basque.
L'organisation de libération de la Palestine.
Dramatische Stunden zu Barcelona.
Ja, neue halbe Stunde von Rock bis Reggae.
So the next book I want to show is, it was actually a supplement to Respect magazine, which is a Czech weekly. They cover politics and economics. This is an issue dedicated to Joseph Koudelka's Prague pictures from 1968. It was published in 1990. Probably everyone watching knows the story behind these photographs, but Joseph Koudelka, of course, a Czech photographer, he's working in Prague, photographing a lot of theater. He had actually, I believe, just gotten back from one of his very early trips photographing Eastern European Roma that would later become his book Gypsies. And apparently, a few days after his return, the Soviet tanks roll into Prague. And of course, there's a huge demonstration, a lot of protest, violence. And Joseph photographs over the course of a couple days. So the photographs, of course, eventually made their way out of Czechoslovakia through the efforts of Anna Farova and this guy Gene Ostroff, who was a curator at the Smithsonian. They got his photographs to the Magnum Photo Agency. They're credited to just an anonymous Czech photographer. Of course, distribution of photographs to the outside wider world, Joseph certainly would have suffered repercussions from that, prison if not worse. Magnum actually offered him a grant then to photograph the Eastern European Roma, which allowed him to get out of Czechoslovakia. The thing about this magazine, this work has been published several times. There's a little photopoche book called Prague 68. Of course, in 2008, you had these large, Aperture published a version. This is the Czech edition made by Torst with the better covers. But it's a book that I actually own twice because I thought it would be appropriate to also get the edition in Cyrillic, the Russian edition, as well as the Czech. And of course this book is, nearly 300 pages and, several hundred photographs. It's beautifully printed, the design is really good and everything. And I really like this book. Obviously I like it, I have 2 copies. But when I look here, this is just a typical newspaper reproduction. The reproductions aren't super great. They're quite rough. Often they're very closed in the black densities of the picture. But there's something that this has that no other book of this work does. There's certain reproduction strategies, or a lack of a reproduction strategy, that suits the work maybe a lot better than the most perfect reproduction. We know this, every book asks for its own kind of presence. What space is that thing going to create? This magazine, probably certainly because it's this newspaper quality, the language of the photography seemed to be less about this amazing, pristine frames that we know from Joseph, and more immediate. It feels more dangerous, even though it's 22 years after the fact. This kind of reproduction, this kind of paper, feels like there's something at stake. Where these books, really great. You can see the photographs more clearly. I can appreciate Joseph's photographs, probably more so in here, but that's not what this is about. This feels a bit safe to me, where the presence of the work in this magazine, it just has a completely different tone. There's a completely different sense of kind of anxiety than in any other book that I've seen this work reproduced in. The last thing I really love about it is they start with this wristwatch picture, which I always thought was Joseph's arm, as if with quite a wide lens he had made this picture almost like a self-portrait. But, of course, he was anonymous, But yet here he is in the picture. And then when the magazine ends, when you flip it, you finally get the face to the arm. You finally get the identity to the arm. In a way, for me, it's the most meaningful because, he can finally be seen. This older photograph of him at the age that he was making the photographs, it's quite a nice coda to the work. It's a really fantastic booklet. It's the booklet that I think does the most service to these photographs, far more so than the published books. So the first children's book that I'm going to show you is actually probably certainly not intended to be a children's book, which is Paul Graham's book Films, published by Mac in 2011. It's a children's book because that's how it operates in our house. My daughters actually pulled this off the shelf, mostly because it has literally the most colorful spine out of all the books that we have. And for those of you that know the book, of course, there are these extreme enlargements of different film stocks that Paul has used over the course of his long career. And they're absolutely beautiful. Of course, it's a kind of love letter to the early foundations of photography. And one of the reasons why I really like that my daughters pulled it off the shelf is because I spent most of my career in photography printing for other photographers. So I have spent countless hours looking through a grain focuser. You don't have to be an analog photographer or have a background in analog photography to have this work resonate with you, but certainly for someone of my age and my experience is part of the draw. And I really like that it was one of the very first photography books that my daughters looked at because of that connection that it had with how I learned photography. And then on the very last page, of course, there's a little bit of an index showing what the film stock was and the different projects that he used that stock on. It's a wonderful book, published by Mac in 2011. Maybe one of the most sought after and kind of more collectible photo illustrated book from Germany is, of course, Edith Rimkus and Horst Bessler's book Boulder Max. It's about this boy who's going to go on a trip to a farm, and while he's asleep, he basically dreams of going to the farm. There's a really cool tractor there that he kind of falls in love with and starts driving all around. Really interesting photo montage and layout. It's super dynamic. All of the silhouetting of children and things. It's really, really super nice. But of course, one of the elements is just these spot colors that show up. Really great. You know, of course, it's a kind of endless dream sequence, so the sizing of things gets a little bit crazy. You know, these big bags, these giant ears of corn. You know, all the geese chasing him. This is one of my favorite ones with the dogs and the balloons. And then the tractor runs out of gas, so then he has to kind of set off on foot by a horse. It's a great spread. Searching out gasoline. He gets some, gets back on his horse, gets back to the Boulder Max tractor. And then it ends with him basically waking up, ready for the trip to start and for the adventure ahead. Really fantastic book. My copy is super beat up, and I kind of love that. It was owned by Jacqueline Dittman back when. Super great book. So the next book kind of falls under this category of books that I'm fascinated with that obviously use photography and use it in a very practical way. But maybe the way that I see the book is obviously far different from the maker's intention. And that's this book of Catholic liturgy. It opens, there's very little text. You have this Latin text. And then you have all of the different ritual from different church, the Coptic church, the Ethiopian, the Syrian, the Greek, the Russian, the Armenian. And it's basically a step-by-step guide for performing these rituals. It's printed in heliogravure. It's really beautiful printing. I really like the layout. The last 80 pages is entirely just photography. There's a separate little booklet of text that slips into the back, which explains step by step what the priests are supposed to be saying and doing. These wonderful spreads. Of course, they're a little clunky here and there. I just randomly found this in a used bookshop. Cost like €4. Really beautiful book. So the next thing is actually just a little plant catalog for lorbeer bushes from this company called Philandria. You know, of course, a lot of companies use photography in their product catalogs. This one was particularly quite charming. You start with a couple landscapes, but then you wind up with this man standing alongside the different lorbeer bushes. To me, of course, there's something quite comic. This guy with his long handlebar mustache, his clogs, standing proudly, the man amongst his wares. Sometimes he smiles, sometimes he doesn't, sometimes he's not exactly sure what to do with his hands. He tucks one in his apron and then one just kind of hanging at his side. I've seen other catalogs from this company, and unfortunately they're not quite as good, but this was a really nice find. This is an industry book about the ironworks Vitkovitz, which was in the Moravia area of the Czech Republic. There are actually probably well over 100 different books on this ironworks. This one in particular is quite fascinating because of who made it. It's a man named Wilhelm Rowell. He was an active photographer, bookmaker, and also he made a lot of postcards. He actually catered towards heavy industry and would photograph a lot in steelworks. And this is a book he did around 1914. Rowell had an industrial publishing company, Rowell Verlag. He would actually approach companies. He would find out, if they were going to have a company anniversary coming up or something of the sort, and he would propose making them a book. And he was kind of like a one-man band of publishing. He would photograph, design, and print the books all under his publishing company. And he was a remarkable photographer. I mean, remember, this is large format plate photography done in very, very difficult conditions in heavy industry. It's loud, dark, dangerous. And he made these really, really not only wonderful photographs, but you can see the design of the books are really beautiful. Each of these plates, you can see it's printed separately and then tipped into this particular book. When he would do commissions for like ironworks or foundries, he would actually overprint a layer of amber to reflect the molten steel. He's not so well known. I think the person that's done the most research on Rowell is Thomas Wiegand here in Germany, who does absolutely brilliant scholarship. It's so delicate. I'm not exactly sure how many books I've seen, maybe about 10 different books by Rowell, and I'm sure there's many more out there. It's surprising few people actually know who he is. This is another company book from this company in Strasbourg called Holweg, and they're simply just they make paper bag making machines. There are thousands of photography books like this, company books, industry books. This one happens to be just extremely beautiful. It's printed by the French firm Drager Ferret, and it's beautiful heliogravure, kind of wonderful design. When you have the book in your hands, it glows. The printing is so beautiful. And it's a paper bag making company. That's what I love. It was a nice find. Plates like these are absolutely beautiful. In the back you have this little kind of fold out showing where they're located. And that's it. It's from 1958. And, you know, did people save these things? Well, I've only seen one copy of it, so I'm guessing not so often. So one of my favorite company books, industry books, is actually Ignis 25. Ignis is an Italian company. They make everything from stoves and refrigerators to irons to hot plates and such. And this was a book from their 25th anniversary. And the beginning has a kind of what is typical with company books. They have a little bit of a history. It was established in 1943. This book was published in 1969. In the beginning, they have these graphs, which I think are quite interesting, a little reminiscent of, I think, of Albers. Really kind of beautiful color, graphic design. And then you get to the photography. Super bright, saturated, a little bit of kitsch here and there. Of course, we're talking about late 60s, so aerial views. Then you get to this, which starts to kind of move in from the grounds into Guido Borghi, who was the founder, into his plaza. And you notice this little guy with this little blue uniform. But then here's where, for me, the book really starts. I had written about this book once, and I described it like if Jacques Tati made a company book for an Italian appliance company, this would more or less be what it looked like. The photographs are just from some Italian photo agency that's actually still around called Publifoto. The actual individual photographers aren't specified. I mean, this could be a picture from NASA. There's a lot of lighting going on in these photographs. I mean, we're talking about dozens upon dozens of strobes. I always love when I turn from this being so accustomed to seeing the blue uniforms, and then all of a sudden you see just, you know, three guys dressed in white lab coats. These are quite wonderful, these huge warehouse where they're double checking, testing everything before it gets packed up. And then they have this little section which is about the different showrooms around, the different company headquarters. A couple aerial views. This is great with the company cars. And then they had a social initiative, of course, for their workers. Buildings, the surrounding landscape, recreational areas and such. And then this is quite wonderful. In the back, of course, if you haven't figured out what they made by now, you have this wonderful panorama catalog of all the different appliances and things they make. I found out the guy that was the photography consultant for this book actually played semi-professional basketball for a team that Ignis sponsored, and then he became their art director. So, great book. So this is one of my favorite and more playful company books that you're gonna find. Some of you probably know it, the Madaus 50-year anniversary book. It's called Eine aufgeschlossene Firma, which means like an open-minded company. And it was published in 1969. It has photographs by Barbara Schultens in it. And it's certainly one of the more inventive company books that you're going to find. It's interesting because this company's quite old, and if you look at many of their other catalogs, they seem quite conservative in their way. But this one, of course, 1969, is quite beautiful. That big little grass from the sheep. Counting the money. It's got quite funny texts. Genius at work. So it has this bird, which of course always reminded me a little of this overview shot from Hitchcock over the gasoline station with the birds flying. But this is, of course, this spread is the most famous, which it's one of the few photography books that incorporates sound. The dead mouse freaks my cats out whenever I do that. Super graphic photography, great design. My copy's completely falling apart. It's kind of rare that you find copies of these with a decent binding and with all of the stuff, like this gigantic wrench here. This plastic glove. This is great. This pop-up of all their medicines. And this, unfortunately, in my copy is kind of broken, but this was like a wadded up sheet of paper that kind of unfolds a little bit, and of course behind it is the wastebasket. And this gigantic droplet. Just a lot of attention to the women employed by the company. And this is quite wonderful. You were supposed to cut this open with a knife. This was sealed shut with a sticker. You cut it open, and then inside is a cookbook and their company history. This is a poster, which is a kind of an old advertisement of theirs. This little pull-up. I don't know that much about the photographer, Barbara Schultens. I know she studied in Essen. I found her name associated with the school in Essen, but other than that, not much. This is great. The hands fold off the ass, and then the laxative inside. It's really great. And then Who is Who? Great, super, super inventive company book. So the next thing is called CBS Television Notebook from 1960. Columbia Broadcasting Systems, of course. And it isn't a photography book, but for me it's associated with photography in a way. It's actually with drawings, illustrations by Robert Weaver, who was an amazing illustrator from basically the mid to late 50s until he died. He actually taught at my school, at the School of Visual Arts, when I was there. I didn't study with him. I know it's a little unfair to kind of compare one artist to another, but they seem to exist on the same wavelength as some Robert Frank pictures that he made on television productions. Of course, a really great one appears in The Americans. But I love this book, and there's something so, in a way, simple about Weaver's style, but yet so authentic. You just immediately get it. And what I love about this book is if you look at the way it's, you know, of course it's a day book, so it's kind of like you're supposed to pencil in appointments during the week, you know, so you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then it's on the Sunday one, when most people have a day off, that they include the drawing, kind of maybe thinking in advance. Most people aren't going to have, you know, a lot of appointments on Sunday. And even the ratio, it's not quite 35 millimeter, it's a little stubbier than 35 millimeter. But it feels a bit like the frame. He was quite well known and respected amongst other illustrators, but a lot of people don't know who he is. His brother is actually Fritz Weaver, the actor, so his brother's quite well known. But pictures like this, with these, you know, it's called dollying in, so the men are, you know, obviously moving the camera in. You have these cable holders, this guy leaning against the light with the headset. Like, you can imagine the photographic equivalent of this picture. The way the frame is constructed, sometimes, you know, there's a bit of an awkwardness where things appear behind the lights. You know, he kind of has a photographer's stance in some ways, if you can imagine that. But this, I really like this lighting board. I mean, sometimes when he shows the monitor, like what the cameraman would be seeing on an actual television screen, he uses an eraser and he kind of buffs away the image a little bit so that it feels a little bit distorted, a little bit snowy, like an old television monitor would be. It's incredible. Incredible drawings. So the last book I'm going to share tonight is Emile Rowell's little book, Die Nutzholzer. Maybe it's a photography book, maybe not. I used to think it's a photography book, now I'm not so sure. It's something that I just kind of randomly found, again, in a flea market. And as you see, after this kind of brief introduction of about 40 pages, the next 90 plates are just photographs of this wood grain, you know, wood veneer. What I really love about this book is, first off, the size. It's so small, it's quite intimate. Of course, aiming to be very practical, you know, you can almost like put it in your pocket. And it's this guide to all these different veneers. And when I saw this, I was like, oh wow, amazing, all these photographs of just wood grain. Of course, the design is just all it needs to be. This beautiful typography, it's a little bit, you know, the spacing between the letters is a little bit wide and clunky. But it was also the printing. The printing, this book is from 1928. So if you think about color reproduction in 1928, that would be very, very early color photographic reproduction. The plates are just, for me, just kind of mesmerizing. Now, I said I'm not sure if it's a photography book because when I researched Emile Rowell, he actually turned out to be an illustrator. And I couldn't quite figure out why an illustrator would, you know, be the author of a book of wood veneer. So it's quite possibly a different Emile Rowell, but there's an Emile Rowell who did a lot of illustration, and so that got me thinking, are these photographs or are they illustrations? They look so much like photographs to me that I'd be almost more impressed if they were painted illustrations of wood grain. Regardless, the book is, it's a little treasure. Emile Rowell. Nice.